Good afternoon, good morning to everyone that's joined us today. Just like to say welcome from the Global Payroll Association and thank you for joining us. For those of you who are not aware of the Global Payroll Association, we're a one-stop shop supplying interactive in-country payroll training via WebEx face-to-face. We also provide membership through a portal on in-depth country resources. My name is Melanie Pitsey and I'm the CEO of the Global Payroll Association. Okay, just to start off with a few housekeeping, please feel free to ask us questions during the webinar. We will have 10 minutes free at the end of the session to answer these. You can either do this by asking the question in the chat box in the bottom right hand corner of your screen, or if you'd like to email us directly to webinars@globalpayrollassociation.com. So I'd like to say thank you to Global Upside, SmugMug and ADP for joining us this afternoon. We have Raghu Bhargava, who is a co-founder and CEO of Global Upside. We have Yvonne Makarov, who is a VP of Finance from SmugMug, and Wes Riani, multinational account sales at ADP. So over to you, Raghu.
Thank you, Melanie, and welcome all to the webinar. As we get into the details of key consideration for global companies, I just want to give you a preview of the agenda. Things that matter when you're expanding overseas are location and footprint. So where are you going to set up and what size of operations you're going to have there. The entity setup, which a little bit of it is driven by your activities, but also you have some options there. Finding the right talent, hiring and employment law, which obviously as you hire people, you need to worry about those. Tax and accounting support, because it's in the US, every government is looking for tax dollars. And managing a global operation, do you centralize or do you decentralize? And compliance issues. So let's get into a little bit more detail. So the first question is where to? What we're talking about is where do you want to set up your operations, which really depends on why you're going overseas. If you're going to attract more customers, generate more sales, then you're obviously looking for a location which has potential customers. However, if you're setting up an R&D or a manufacturing facility, then you need to set it up possibly in a low-cost jurisdiction, possibly where there is availability of the right talent, engineers and the like. And in some countries, there's a little bit more focus in the engineers on a particular side of technology versus others, so you need to be careful about that. Obviously, the startup activities entail how you're going to get going. I mean, is it just a small operation with one or two people, or are you setting up with a larger audience, larger employee base? And depending on that, you may need to worry about can you set up a representative office, or do you have to set up a branch or a subsidiary? Because obviously these different forms have their own limitations, benefits and advantages, and so you have to take those into consideration in terms of your short-term and long-term goals. Generally, if you're setting up manufacturing or R&D operations, you are limited to the one choice of forming a subsidiary. Now, once you've picked a location and you have decided what type of entity or corporate structure you need to have in that country, the first thing comes about is payroll setup, because you're going to go look for the talent. As soon as you put them on your payroll, as soon as you hire them, you need to start paying them. And so there is payroll setup, which also entails either a bank account or just your basic money movement services, because it is not just a matter of hiring people. You have to pay them in a foreign country, most probably in a foreign currency, because US dollars aren't an accepted form of payment in most countries. Once you have your people and your payroll going, then you have a monthly accounting requirements, and so how are you going to set up your accounting operations? Who's going to manage that, and how are they going to manage it? Because obviously, as you are just starting those foreign operations, it is extremely hard and expensive to hire people to do your accounting there locally, because you do not want to have 3 people in your sales function and 1 person in your G&A function, which would result in a 33% overhead. Pretty damn expensive. Obviously, there are tax considerations. So depending on the type of entity you set up and depending on what your activities you're doing there, you have to worry about tax. And taxes are more than just income taxes, because you have to worry about the payroll taxes you're deducting. How do you pay them to the government? You may have VAT, GST type requirements, the equivalent of sales and use tax requirements in that country, and how do you get through all of those filing requirements? How do you capture that information? And if you're not familiar with those taxes, then how do they operate? Because they're very different than the US sales use tax regimes. Obviously, now that you've addressed some of your basic concerns, you're now planning for growth. What is your intent? How many people are you going to hire over the next 3, 6, 9 months, maybe even longer? Yes, manufacturing facilities require time to build, and it takes time to even recruit engineers, as an example, but you do have to plan for it because you may need to worry about office space and things like that. The setup of operations in foreign locations brings with it the permanent establishment risk. So to the extent you're setting up a representative office or a branch office, you have to worry about the PE risk being established for the parent company or the company that is setting up the representative office. And to mitigate that, yes, setting up a subsidiary makes a lot of sense, but that does require time and effort and a little bit more effort than setting up say a representative office. And as you are thinking about your various operations from manufacturing to R&D in particular, you have to think about IP, the intellectual property considerations, which in many countries the IP rules are much more lenient or barely enforced. So if you are transferring or generating IP, transferring it for manufacturing or generating IP in a foreign country, you need to make sure that you have the proper structure in place, that not only is it protected locally, but also it resides in the right jurisdiction. So whether it's the U.S. or some other jurisdiction that you have a tax structure around, you need to make sure that your IP considerations are properly addressed. And the last item on the slide is the management support and centralization. So like I pointed out, you're not going to have a 33% overhead to hire 1 back office person for 3-person operation. So you kind of have to think about centralizing some of these functions or utilizing a service provider like ourselves. But more importantly, as you plan for future and as you look at your growth, you have to worry about how are you going to support that growth. So obviously, as you go from 5 to 50 to 500, your requirements change and the support requirements change. But no matter what happens locally in terms of headcount, you always have to think about the management support that is required, because management may reside in a foreign country versus locally. As you establish a subsidiary in a foreign country, this is a pretty comprehensive list of things that you need to worry about. So first of all, you need a registered office. The purpose of the registered office is so that if the government needs to send you a notice, they know where to mail it. The office has to be a physical presence. It cannot be a PO box. So if somebody wants to serve a subpoena or something, and this is why generally we recommend not to have your employee's home address as a registered office. It is doable. It is just that it is doable, I should say, in most countries. There are some that don't allow home addresses to be registered offices. But what you don't want to have happen is that employees' address plastered all over the government's website, because these registered offices are subject to discovery by just typing the name of the company in that country. It is a matter of public record. So the next one is the resident director, and these resident directors have a lot of power, a lot of authority and responsibility in that country. And again, if you just have a sales office with 3 people, most of you don't have a senior enough person to be a resident director for you. Now, in some EU countries, as an example, an EU resident can be a resident director in another country till to the extent they are a resident of EU, but some countries don't allow that. So then you need to find somebody locally. And these are some of these things. Some of these services are things that somebody like Global Upside can provide. Obviously, we talked a little bit about the PE risk, and related is really the substance over form or tax structure issue. So you used to be able to just have a PO box type location, a registered office location, and run transactions through a country and get the tax benefit of a lower tax jurisdiction. The local countries as well as foreign countries are cracking down on it. So now you actually need to have some substance versus just a form, and so that's another thing that you need to worry about. And if it is a tax reason that you're going into a particular country. Data protection, and you've all heard of many data breaches across the world. So data protection is becoming a bigger deal. Companies are now required to register, submit a plan, things like that. And this is just a compliance requirement. You have to update those things on a periodic basis and stuff. From a tax perspective, obviously there is payroll tax. That is the first thing that starts, because you're withholding some from the employees. You have some employer matching contributions, things like that. But some of the other taxes, VAT, income taxes, and in many countries there are like TDS, tax deducted at source, excise, and many other forms of taxation, because obviously that's just like every country is short on funds. The government is short on funds, so they're trying to levy taxes and stuff like that. Most countries outside of the U.S. require a statutory audit. This is not an independent audit. This is not like the audit done by the Big Four as an example, but this is governed under different rules, governed under local GAAP, but the reporting requirements are different, and generally these statutory audits are done by a local audit firm versus your corporate auditor, because that would be a little too expensive. Obviously, size determines that scope of that, so the larger the size, the more companies tend to have their corporate auditors do it. Otherwise, you just hire somebody local. And then once a year, you're required to file what's called an annual report. So you attach your audited financials, you attach some other information to it, and you have to file it with the registrar of companies or the equivalent authority in that country. And all of this becomes a matter of public record, by the way. So you have to be careful that you run your company properly and you get a clean statutory audit opinion. So when you file, it doesn't raise red flags to your customers, to your vendors, to your employees that the company has issues and they're not addressing properly. Next slide, please. Getting into more nuts and bolts about the payroll considerations and some of the compliance requirements around payroll. So remember, payroll is not just a matter of paying net pay. Yes, it is, from an employee's perspective, it is the most important piece, but from a broader perspective, there's calculations that go into it, there's taxability of various items, there are lots and lots of compliance requirements around this. So as an example, certain in-kind benefits, like a car lease, is not taxable in Belgium, but is taxable in France. And these variations happen even like in the EU zone and can change country by country or geography by geography. So Asia Pacific may have very different rules around certain things versus the Western Europe kind of thing, or Africa. So you have to be very smart about what all are you providing to your employees and what is the taxability of those benefits. And for example, in China, and I'll talk a little bit more about it, the housing allowance is a non-taxable event, where if you were paying a housing allowance to an employee here in the US, it is a taxable event. There are many more reporting requirements besides the equivalent of a W-2. So obviously you have to give the employee an annual W-2 so that he knows what his gross earnings were, his withholdings and tax payments and things like that. But from a corporate perspective, companies are required to capture and report on a periodic basis on a lot of fringe benefits, on in many countries on time and attendance, on leave, various types of leaves, that the employees are eligible for. And so there's a whole system that you need, a whole process you need in the back end to track this, even though you may have only one employee, to track it and then report it on a periodic basis. Some of them are annual, but some of them can be more frequent. The pay slips, and we're all in the US used to having a pay slip come through us through an online portal by companies like ADP who are obviously processing our payroll here. But in many countries, there are a lot more requirements around pay slips. For example, in France, you have to deliver a hard copy or a snail mail pay stub, pay slip, and these pay slips have over 40 items that have to be reported on a monthly basis. So it creates a level of complexity that people, a lot of times, depending on where they are not used to the requirements. Obviously, payroll is in the middle of HR, talent acquisition, treasury from a funding perspective, and accounting from a reporting perspective. So there is a lot of coordination that the payroll team has to do, and I'm sure you guys are familiar with that, to get the right information from either the talent acquisition team or through HR, and then coordinating with treasury so that the employees get paid properly. There's funding in the local accounts and things. And obviously at the end of the payroll run, reporting that information to the accounting team so they can book the payroll entries, the accruals of vacation, things like that, so that the accounting records are true and accurate. Pay frequency in most countries is once a month outside of the US. However, that can change depending on the type of people you have. So for example, in New Zealand, pay frequency is once a month, but if you have manufacturing operations, then it becomes weekly. And sometimes it is also governed by union agreements or collective bargaining agreements, commonly referred to as CBAs, where the CBA governs the frequency of the payroll and also by type of employee that you're paying. In certain countries like Brazil, if an employee applies for a vacation, they have to be paid for that vacation time before they go on vacation. So these are, again, additional complexities that come about in payroll versus just saying, yeah, I know what your gross compensation is because it was in the contract, and here is your net pay. So keep a lot of these in mind, and obviously, get the right help to the extent you don't have that knowledge base within the company. Next slide. Oh, so giving a few examples, in China. In China, most rules are made by the federal government or the central government, national government. However, the interpretation and enforcement of the rules are left up to the provincial government, the districts, or the cities. So you could have two employees, one in Shanghai and one in Beijing, and the interpretation, application of the laws are so different that they are really like you are having to run two different payrolls. You cannot put all of those people in different geographies on one payroll, as an example. I already mentioned that the housing provided by employers, housing allowance provided by employers is not taxable. However, there might be some local jurisdiction that says no, for the local city purposes or something like that, that becomes taxable because of the difference in interpretation and enforcement. Another unique feature in China is that you have to work 1 year and then you get 5 days of vacation. So it's a little bit not employee friendly in that respect, but obviously most companies provide more benefit because who wants to work for a company that only provides 5 days of vacation a year? Next slide, please. So in Brazil, there is the concept of the 13-month payroll. So what you do is you divide your annual payroll not by 12 to pay the monthly payroll, but you divide by 13. And so you get, if you're on a $120,000 salary, your gross pay per month is not $10,000, it's a little bit less. That 13th paycheck is then paid out to the employees in 2 installments, half of it in November and half of it in December. The idea being it's sort of a forced savings plan, which allows you to have a little extra cash around the holidays. Brazil is, in a lot of countries, have gone to electronic reporting of a lot of these things that you have to file with the government that I mentioned before. Brazil is a little bit new to this requirement. They've just brought this in the last 12 months. And union dues are interesting concept in Brazil because almost every employee is covered by a union. The real difference comes about is if you are a member of the union, you have to contribute a piece of your earnings to the union for the ultimate benefit that they might provide you. But if you're not a member, you still are covered by a union agreement, but you don't have to contribute to the union. So you can see where you have a union and you have your employees there, and some of them you have to contribute to the union and others you don't. So it creates another level of complexity in it. In payroll. Next slide, please. So talking about Russia, so in Russia there is, just like in many other countries, there is a requirement to keep detailed records of working hours by day, by week, by month, because the government has the right to come and audit that, and if you haven't maintained those contemporaneous documentation, you can be fined. To prove to the government that the employees are working and these are the hours they're working and things like that. Russia is one of those exceptions where employees are paid twice a month. And in Russia, because the local requirement for employment contracts is that it has to be in the local language, but obviously people across the globe don't necessarily read and understand Russian. So most foreign companies then have a bilingual contract, an English version in one column and side by side with the Russian version, so that you comply with the local law, but you're also addressing the needs of the corporate employees who are actually responsible for issuing these. Next slide, please. In France actually enforces the working hour requirements even more than countries like Russia, and so there is a lot of requirements around not just the work-related tracking, but also vacation tracking and all kinds of other things that are required to be tracked. In France, one of the things you have to remember is that the registration for payroll taxes takes as much as 90 days. And it is actually called matriculation, not registration. And because the government understands that it takes 90 days, you can actually run a payroll without being registered first. And you are allowed a one-time exception of paying those payroll taxes a little late, so post-registration, and there won't be any penalty or taxes associated with that. And that's just a one-time exception there. And I also already mentioned the complex pay slips in France, where even though you may have sent them a electronic pay slip, you still are required to give them a hard copy pay slip, and these pay slips have over 40 data fields. With that, I'd like to turn over to Ivan for his presentation.
Thank you, Raghu. I really wish I would listen to some of that information years ago when we started dealing with these international issues. I'm now very familiar with through experience and working with you guys about how it can be very complex to set up in a new country, a new environment, a new economy. But before I go into some of the issues we've experienced over the years, I want to give you a brief introduction of SmugMug. If we can go to the next slide. SmugMug is an internet-based business that operates in what I call this new economy, where we don't manufacture anything. We have a small office in Mountain View in the heart of Silicon Valley, but about half of our workforce work for us remotely. They don't come into the office, they work from their homes, and they do this in the U.S. in various states, and they do this abroad. One of the key advantages we have for an internet business, we have a 24/7 customer support. So whenever you have a problem with our service, we host photos. If, for example, you have some issues, you don't know how to figure it out, how to work your website, you email our customer support, and 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, on Christmas Day, in the summer, in the middle of the night, you get a response within the first hour. And in order to maintain that, obviously, we have to hire people in different time zones. We have a number of people on the West Coast, on the East Coast, and we have a small number of employees in Europe that take care of the other shifts when it's middle of the night in America. And so that helps us to maintain that as one of our key advantages, but it also comes with the complexity of operations. And the main complexity is what Raghu already mentioned, is that whenever you're in a new tax jurisdiction, you're dealing with a new set of laws, you're dealing with legal requirements, you're dealing with taxes, and all of a sudden things can get complicated very quickly. People that work for us are very proud to say that they work for SmugMug, so we want to make sure that we're compliant and that we hire them as employees. And so the other thing that we see, especially the last few years since the recession, the governments realized that they've struggled to raise funds when the economies were struggling, still the issue in Europe, and so the laws are constantly changing, and in order to raise more revenue, in order to tax the companies more, and so we just can't keep up about this on our own. And whenever we realize that we want to make sure that we're compliant with the local laws in these countries where we have employees, we quickly realized that we really cannot do this on our own. We need outside help. We can figure out how payroll can be run in Texas or New York or any of these other states, but it's a whole different ballgame when you're talking about UK, when you're talking about Korea, when you're talking about Germany. And these other countries have very different laws, and also it's hard. It's hard from a logistically standpoint to keep on top of all that. So we wanted to keep our team, our finance and HR team, lean and small. Did not want to hire extra people just to maintain the employment of the other people in other tax jurisdictions. And so outsourcing was a good option, a cost-efficient option for us of how we can be compliant, but also not increase our overhead significantly. So that's what we did. We worked with Global Upside to help us set up internationally and to hire employees. And here's a few things we learned, and we can go to the next slide, please. First thing we have to do as the finance and HR team, we have to educate our staff about some of the basic challenges. I mentioned the fact that we're an internet-based company that works in this new economy. This new economy means that people can work anywhere. And in fact, what we find as the tech business is that engineers these days almost expect that. And we can find good engineers here in the Valley, but it's very, very competitive. We have to pay them premium, and there's a large battle, especially for smaller companies like us. SmugMug is not Google, it's not Oracle, and so forth. So we compete with these companies. We're still able to hire successfully. One of the key advantages that we offer is that they don't necessarily have to come into the office in Silicon Valley. They can live in other states. They can live in Oregon. They can live in other countries even, and still be productive and be effective and contribute to the business. And so, but we have to educate them about that. If they're remote, if they're living in the U.S. and they want to work from abroad, we recently had an employee that wanted to travel and work in different states. We have to educate that employee and our HR staff about what that means as far as reporting, as far as potential risks of creating nexus in these states, and of course the tax returns for that employee, what that could mean. Likewise, oftentimes have employees that come in and say, hey, I want to see if I can move to a foreign country, so we have to educate them. And of course, there's always ability to get yourself into these situations when we go to, say, a trade show in a foreign country or on a state where we're not set up. So we have to manage risk, and we have to minimize it. And the other thing that we have to do on a constantly is educate also the hiring managers. Because we have this remote workforce, that doesn't mean that we can hire wherever we can find a good engineer. And so we work with recruiters. Oftentimes, the head of HR comes into my office and says, hey, we have a very good candidate in such and such a country and such a state. Can we do this? Can we hire that? And so then we have to look deeper into that and realize what that potentially means for our business. So that's some of the things we deal with, and wanted to share a couple of things that were useful for us on the next slide. whenever I have this question when somebody comes into my office, whether it's an engineer that has a friend that lives in Germany, or we went to a trade show and we met with a really good candidate who saw a job opening, but for example works in Canada or lives in Canada and wants to stay in Canada. It's surprising that not everybody wants to move to California. So people want to stay and work from home and be where they're at, despite a permanent summer here. And so when they come in, with a lot of jurisdictions I'm familiar with, especially those that we were already set up or we were set up before. But sometimes I just have to say, I don't know, let me find out if we can hire that person. And one of the first things that I do, I start doing internet research. I, of course, go to some of my tax research tools. I can also call our consultants and find out, okay, tell me what you think if we hired an employee here. What would that mean? What would that mean in terms of additional overhead? How much would it cost us to run payroll there? What is it like to run payroll in that country? How often do we have to pay them? Do we have to pay them in the local currency? There's a lot of questions. We have a list of questions that we go through, and we try to figure it out. This is something we want to do. The next thing, you have to be upfront with your potential employees, especially if it's a situation where somebody's relocating to a new country or a new jurisdiction, is there's a different cost of living. It's a one thing you pay your engineer an average salary in Silicon Valley is a very different average salary in EU, for example. Engineers make a different amount of money. Likewise in Asia, very different compensation packages and expectations. And so if somebody is moving outside of the Bay Area to one of these lower paying countries, we have to have a conversation with them from the beginning. They said there might be a pay adjustment, and there also might be an adjustment to the other parts of your compensation package. Example, benefits. Whenever a U.S. employee comes and says, hey, I want to experience, I want to move to a different country for whatever reason, we often have to tell them, do you realize that may mean you will lose your health coverage? You will lose your a great insurance, or you will lose your life insurance, or whatever, things that are much harder to get abroad. You have to deal with different taxes. A lot of people don't realize that and are surprised when they find out that moving to a different country means they're going to have to pay higher taxes. Visas, cost of living, currency fluctuations, especially recently, last year, we've seen large currency fluctuations in UK and Europe with Brexit and other implications, and the results of the elections, and not just in the US, but in foreign countries too, have really shaken up the economy. And we have to explain that to the employees and say that even if we found a way to make this happen, your life will get complicated. So we have to be upfront and open and have a very good communication channels. An example of that, a recent project that we're working with still with Global Upside is setting up in Korea. We have a key employee that we wanted to keep and to make sure that we're compliant, and the employee is relocating to Korea. So when we made that decision that we're going to make this work for us and for the employee, we reached out, and I didn't know anything about local laws in Korea. I'm not familiar with Asia. We have employees in the EU, but this is the first for us to go into Asia. And of course, the laws in Asia are different, in Korea specifically. So we looked into employment contract, looked into things like compensation, payroll. It turns out that in Korea, you need to have a full-on subsidiary before you can employ that. So we are in the middle of creating that, and the subsidiary needs to have a director, like Raghu mentioned, and have a local presence, and it's taking time, but we can run payroll as soon as we're through with that process. And this is not something that I can execute on my own. So we're glad we're partnered up with a good team that has experience in that, and that owns that from start to finish. At the end of the day, when we're through with that project and we have a formal employment in place and the payroll is running, I think everyone's happy. The company is going to be happy, the employee is going to be happy, and we'll continue to grow as a business. So these are some of the issues. They are definitely doable. Years ago, before we started dealing with this, this looked like a very scary land and very scary thing to get into because, as you know, U.S. alone and the way the states are working and the nexus rules and this economy and how that's changing is scary enough. But then you enter an international arena, and if you need to have international employees, then that complicates everything. But it's still possible to navigate, and it's still possible to run that cost efficiently, and with help of other parties. So with that experience and with these thoughts, I'd love to turn it over to Wes with ADP for the next part of our presentation.
Okay, just bear with me, Wes, and I'll just unmute you. Okay, far away, Wes.
Great, thank you. Thank you, Yvonne. Thank you, Raghu. That was a great update on some of the challenges and some of the complexities of doing payroll globally. A little bit about myself. I'm a subject matter expert on workforce management globally for ADP. ADP, for many of you that might know or not know about ADP, we provide workforce management tools for organizations ranging from 1 employee to thousands of employees across the globe. We're present in 112 countries, providing services from global HR, global payroll, global time and attendance, and additional ancillary services, benefits, and other services across the globe for organizations. So let's go to the next slide, please. One of the things that you've heard from Raghu and from Yvonne is compliance and managing compliance across the globe for smaller and larger organizations. And I felt that this was a really telling survey done by Thomson Reuters. What you see here is 58% of businesses surveyed viewed that promoting a culture of integrity is the ultimate goal for their compliance and ethics programs. So you start to see that across the globe, ethics and compliance has become a top-of-mind issue for organizations and leaders across various levels of employment organizations. And in doing so, organizations are seeing a benefit in increasing their bottom line, whether it is reducing risk or increasing their market brand or reduction of fines. One of the things that ADP has found out of our experience is that typically it may cost a certain point to be compliant in a certain country. However, fines, if you are not compliant, some companies will choose not to do the compliance right up front. It typically will cost them 33 to 60% higher than the actual project itself to be compliant. And what I mean by that is, let's say you need to implement a solution in a country to be compliant, like a banking institution or a banking structure or a certain amount of taxation structure, because some companies will choose to save money and not do so. And once they are fined, they're essentially paying 30 to 60% higher cost to fix the issue than to have done it to begin with. So while initially you may be thinking of cost reduction, in the long term, it's costing you more. What you see over on the right side of the slide here is that really 75% of compliance leaders expect management will require more attention to compliance issues, as you've heard from Yvonne and from Raghu earlier on that. So what that basically means is that organizations are really spending a minimum of at least one entire day per week tracking and analyzing regulatory changes. Changes that are coming across from various countries. So how do you manage that? And how do you maintain an updated compliant structure within your organization? So we'll talk about that in a second. Can we go to the next slide? So let me share with you some of these regulatory changes and what happens with these regulatory changes. I decided to focus a little bit on Latin America. So compliance requirements in Latin America can be really complex and difficult to interpret, really with frequent changes. I'll talk a little bit in a future slide on how frequent these changes are occurring. But in particular, for example, Brazil, the complex tax structure is really subject to a lot of frequent changes as the government is trying to respond to a developing economy. Many of you have heard of e-social, and for many companies over the past 2 years, they've been trying to stay abreast of the changes that are coming across, the frequency of changes. So how do you maintain an update on that, and how are you being made aware of these changes? If you have 1 or 2 employees in that country, how do you then find out if you are subject to some of these changes? So a little bit more detail. Colombia, for example, forms for new starters physically have to be taken to the authorities to be stamped and signed and copies sent to payroll. So those are physical paper-based forms. In Argentina, some employers register all their employee relationships in a payroll book, an actual book that is inspected periodically by the Ministry of Labor there. Or in Mexico, some employers have gone as far as having the employees sign their payslips and retain documentation of that, and retain that documentation for 5 years. And now with Mexico's e-social, and you're producing electronic payslips, how do you then get electronic signatures and retain that electronic signature for your records if you're audited? If we can go to the next slide. So it's not only payroll-related legislative changes that you have to stay abreast and on top of. Many HR administrative requirements also have an effect on your payroll. So onboarding, separation processes, time and leave processes, records management, as I talked about earlier, really put a burden on your payroll and your payroll organization. So requirements to sign payslips, complex rules around hiring and firing in some countries. So I'll give you an example. In Mexico, for some organizations, they choose to make a final severance payment in front of a judge in order to avoid any future claims from that departing employee. In Brazil, for example, once you terminate the employee on the termination date, you have to have all of their final payments ready and handed over to them on that final day. So how do you calculate that? And if that final day happens in an abrupt situation, are you capable of calculating and providing that information immediately? So the HR realm and the payroll realm become really blended in a situation like that. So how do you manage that? How do you stay on top of these regulatory changes? And how do you maintain compliance with these regulatory changes? Go to the next slide, please. So to give you an idea of the frequency of these changes over a period of time, this is through mid-2016. This is based on ADP studies and our presence in 112 countries. I've taken a sample of these regulatory changes. So Brazil, for example, went from 3 regulatory changes that affect payroll to 48, and midway through 2016, an additional 15 came across. In Canada, went from 5 to 76, and by 2016, 47 regulatory changes came across. Mexico went to 76 in a span of 3 years, and then 52 by mid-2016. So you see the frequency of these changes coming across. How do you keep up with that? And this is where it's critical that you identify a partner or have presence in the local country. So I'm going to talk a little bit more about that in the next slide. So beyond the complexity of keeping up with compliance is also funding your payroll. So your governance model really needs to play a role in how you fund payroll. A lot of these compliance or regulatory changes deal with funding. A lot of countries are now putting in laws and regulations that will prevent fraud or prevent money laundering. So it's making sure that you're set up structurally accurately for your global payroll. I deal quite often with companies that want to fund payroll straight from the U.S. and wire money into a local country. That can be very expensive, and it can also be non-compliant to a local country's statutory laws. So for example, Australia, you're required to have a bank account in the local country and pay out of the local country. You cannot wire money into an employee's bank account directly from the U.S. You have to have a local bank account ready and available. Asia Pac, what we refer to as lodgement services. An example of that is social benefits in China. In some cases, you have to physically go into an office, a social benefits office in the city you're operational in, and make the deposit for the social benefits and get a stamped approval that the deposit was accepted by the social benefits officer in that city. So how do you manage that with only one employee in that country? And this is where partnerships that you might have with Global Upside or ADP can come in handy to provide you these services. So for many organizations, they'll leverage an in-country provider to move their funds. The in-country provider will access the client's local bank account and fund accordingly, or create a trust account on your behalf in that country and fund from that. Or you would have your own treasury services that would fund accordingly. And then as a last option, some companies will go through a global money movement platform from organizations like Bank of America in the US or HSBC or Deutsche Bank that will provide these types of services. But again, these services can become complex and expensive. So some organizations then will go back to creating their own bank account or leveraging a provider like ADP that has presence in these countries or support through Global Upside. Let's go to the next slide. So managing these complex relationships, compliance and money movement really requires a lot of different solutions and systems. So as we've studied organizationally outside of the US, we found that most organizations will leverage individual systems in each country. Having dealt with a company last week that had 10 countries, I asked this question, well, how many payroll systems are you using? And they mentioned, well, we have one in each country. So that meant they had 10 payroll systems. How many HR systems are you using? Well, we have 10, one in each country. We have an independent system. One country had a spreadsheet. Another country had an HR system, a local HR system. Another had paper-based. So that meant 10 HR systems. So altogether, they were managing 20. What about time and attendance? Well, for the countries that we have more than 10 employees and they're hourly, we use a local time and attendance system or we use a time clock. So that added another 5 systems that they were managing. So altogether, for 10 countries, and they had about 100 people across those 10 countries, they were managing 25 different systems to pay their employees. How do you manage that? So what we found is that it wasn't just payroll that was affecting the workforce cycle. So some organizations were starting to go towards what we call a global system of record, what you see in the center of the screen here. And then they had to identify systems that revolved around that. Talent management systems, time and labor management systems, compliance systems, compensation and benefit systems, and obviously payroll. How do you interact with all of these, and how do you have them communicate with each other? So that was a challenge for a lot of organizations. So not only are you challenged with compliance, not only are you challenged with money movement and managing the money aspect of your workforce, but then how do you manage all of these systems and have them talk to each other and stay compliant on top of it? So if we can go to the next slide. So this is where organizations are starting to really move towards, and that is integrating all these systems together so they can minimize the tools that they're managing into 1 or 2 or 3 tools rather than managing 25, 30. So you start with your global HR system of record on the far right, and then leverage integration to manage the data translation. So if you imagine, if you have a global system of record, an HR system that is English-based, how do you take that data and send it to China? Or how do you stay compliant with the Russia regulations that says your HR data for your employees needs to reside in Russia, it cannot reside externally. So you need to make sure that your HR system of record is compliant, but not only compliant, it can feed data for integration to feed to payroll. And over at the far bottom, a time and attendance or an expense system needs to feed data back and forth to payroll as well, because you need to pay your employees either globally or locally. So all of that revolves around integration and having a tool that will allow you to translate the data, validate the data, map the data locally, and then manage the data appropriately beyond that. So if we can go to the next slide, please. So based on that, and I'm sorry, I lost my internet connection. Moderator, would you be able to tell me what slide we're on?
Sorry, Wes. Sorry, Wes. We've just gone on to the Q&A now. So the last slide was that. Is that okay?
Yes, let's do that.
Okay. Thank you. Hopefully the other guys can join us. So I'll have one question that's been emailed into us. At what point should a company seek outside help with managing their global payroll?
Well,
Raghu, do you want to start and then I can jump in?
Yeah. Is that Raghu?
Yeah. So,
okay.
it is a little bit of a tricky question, but typically it depends a little bit on the expertise that you have in-house. And because most of us are very good, like Yvonne was saying, in our home country, but not very good as we start to cross the border. Generally, we recommend to the clients that if you don't have the expertise, just hire a service provider on day one. Obviously, if you have expertise and you're going to UK as the first country of expansion, it may make sense to keep it in-house. But remember the logistics and the complexities around, now having multiple country payrolls, time zones, and at least in UK, English is still English. But if you go into a country like France and Germany where there is language barriers also, you got to be cognizant of all of those factors and how they will play into it. And so typically it's a good idea to start off with a service provider earlier in your life versus later.
And from my perspective, Raghu, this is Yvonne. I'll also add that I completely agree with that because it's a lot easier to plan and do things properly, set up properly from the beginning, than to unwind a mess that you might have created by not planning properly. Whenever you hire internationally, you can do tax planning, you can think about things like IP and other things, but if you already went into that country and set up on your own without proper advice and according to the rules, there are penalties, it's going to be very unpleasant to unwind all of that and get into the right situation. You're going to spend a lot more time and effort doing that.
And from our perspective, from ADP's perspective, it's really looking at your full spectrum of workforce management. How are you going to manage the data flow, whether it's from an HR system to a time and attendance system, and taking those into consideration. But as I would agree with both Yvonne and Raghu, is earlier on the better, is identifying a partner that is going to provide you capabilities, not just within your immediate need, but also within your future needs. So taking into consideration the future need that you have is also critical, and having a partner that is going to be able to grow with you and provide you support accordingly.
Okay, this is a message for Yvonne. What went into your vendor assessment when you were choosing a vendor to help you with your global payroll?
That's a good question. For us, a couple of things were important. Number one, that the company that we're working with had expertise in all jurisdictions that we're in. Some of the vendors we spoke to had a good expertise for UK, but couldn't support our smaller countries. For example, we have an employee in Slovenia, and that's not the country you typically think of or have a lot of experts on in their local laws. But so we have to find somebody who is able to support our unique facts and some of these smaller countries. And the other thing that we wanted to do, we wanted to remain small, and so it was important for us not have to hire a bunch more other people and remain small in these countries. That doesn't increase our overhead, and so that's definitely possible when you work with the right vendor and the right expertise. That this can still happen, and of course things only get better and not worse when you're working with the right company.
Okay, another question. My company is looking to expand its operations to Japan. Is there anything that we need to be aware of? I don't know which one of you.
Take that, and then Wes, maybe you can chime in.
Yeah.
So Japan is one of those countries with language barriers. And most people in Japan don't speak good English. And as you go down the ranks, it makes it even harder. There's a lot of compliance requirements in Japan. It is a very closed society from a business perspective. So there's lots of challenges that you have to worry about. And even though sometimes in a country like Japan where the law may have changed, for example, 2 years ago they changed the law so it doesn't require a resident director anymore. From a business practice perspective, when you go to open a bank account in Japan, they want to know who the resident director is. They don't care that you have directors that live outside of Japan. So there are factors and business environment issues that you need to understand, and Japan happens to be not a very complicated jurisdiction, but a little bit more red tape than we are used to in the US, but a lot less compared to countries like Brazil or China or other countries. So,
from our perspective, it's the taxation and the various forms of benefits that are provided and the various forms that need to be filed. And this is where those things you have to be aware of rather than just entering and paying an employee. What are some of the additional functions that need to happen, and who's going to pay those, and how are those going to be addressed for you? So from a payroll perspective, those are the complexities. And then in comparison to other companies, what are the benefits you're going to offer versus other companies that are similar to you offering in that country? And this is where a partnership would come in handy and really addressing those two. So take those into consideration as you enter into that market. And then whether you're going to have a provider that is going to register you on your behalf, or you're going to receive legal support from somebody externally to register you as well. Those are things that you need to take into consideration.
Okay, the next question. How are companies recording international working hours?
So from ADP's perspective, there's a number of methods. If you have a local national, typically what we see from most organizations from a smaller size will leverage a local time and attendance solution. We see a range from spreadsheet hours to all the way through more complex time and attendance solutions that have hardware clocks or software clocks. So the other thing to take into consideration if you're a global organization is, are you going to partner with a solution that's going to provide you global reach into across multiple countries, so the user experience is the same, whether I am in Germany versus China, I'm using the same solution, but I'm also using it in the same language. Now we see a lot of HR solutions offering time and attendance as well, but that leaves into question whether that time and attendance is going to be compliant to the local statutory laws. And then beyond time and attendance, the thing to take into consideration is leave management. Often leave management is separate from actual hours tracked. The other portion of that to take into consideration, am I going to leverage these hours for project-based time that I need to pull into my ERP or into my financials? So you have to take a look at that totality. While it's a simple question on the surface, there's a lot of complexities that go beyond it. Raghu, any other input?
Yeah, so Wes, I think you also mentioned early on in your presentation about how this company had 25 different systems between payroll, HR, time tracking, and stuff. And so last year we launched a product called Mihi, mihi.info, and what it does, it allows you to have one platform across the world to track some of these leave, time and attendance, some of your benefits, with some workflow built into it. So that allows you to do a lot of stuff that you were talking about. You know, I hate to toot my own horn, but it is a unique system with no comparable product out there. And it allows you to have one platform where you can look at the world and run reports and manage your workforce. So it is not an HRIS system, it is a time and attendance and leave tracking system. Because in many countries, there's many types of leaves
so that is a complex animal in and of itself, is time and leave management. It all depends on what level of complexity you want to take it. As I mentioned, whether you're going to do project-based or you're looking for statutory compliance or all of that, those have to be all looked at. But certainly Global Upside solution, or obviously ADP has solutions depending on the situation and the complexity and the level of the situation. Those can be addressed through ADP as well.
Okay. Well, thank you guys. Our hour is now up. I'd just like to say thank you to everyone that has attended this afternoon for this webinar. If you have any questions, as you see on the slide, you can contact Global Upside if you have any questions, or call them. You can also email the Global Payroll Association at webinars@globalpayrollassociation.com if you have any further questions. We do have some questions that we weren't able to answer, and hopefully you guys are happy to answer that. We can just share that with everyone that's attended today. And just like to say thank you once again.
Goodbye, everyone.
Bye, guys. Thanks.